Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Stories: The Path of Destinies for PC and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is somewhere between an action-adventure game and a role-playing game. I would hesitate to call it a full-on role-playing game because of something I'll get to more when I get to the story and the gameplay section. But regardless, it was developed by Spearhead Games and released in April of this year, and you may have seen my MTO on the earlier preview build of it. But if you haven't seen that, then full disclosure here, the developers actually sent me a review copy to take a look at, and I do greatly appreciate that because honestly, I wouldn't have known this game existed were it not for the developers getting in contact with me. Which is a shame because I enjoyed the living hell out of Bastion and Transistor, and this is kind of in the same vein as those, although it does go its own route, which is to say that it actually ends up being more like a choose-your-own-adventure book than it does a full-on role-playing game or a simple straight-up action-adventure game. And the question with that becomes, is that enough to set this thing aside from the rest of the pack, and more importantly, is that something that becomes a gimmick, or is it an actually compelling part of the game? Well, as far as presentation goes, you have a distinct divide between the art style and the visual quality. The visual quality itself is fairly average for an indie game. Nothing is particularly high res, in fact a lot of it's fairly low res. The texture quality isn't particularly detailed, nor are the animations. In fact, a lot of them are rather jerky, as I'm sure you can tell just from the video. But as I said, there is a divide between that visual quality and the art style because that visual quality actually works okay considering that this is trying to be very bright, colorful, and cartoony. The thing is that while this does excuse the vast majority of the lower res stuff and the jerky animations, unfortunately it doesn't really excuse the fact that there are some bits of this game that just are straight up undetailed, and that mostly has to do with the actual texture quality, so they could have done a bit better on that, but generally speaking the game actually ends up looking pretty good just because its art style is enough to pull it through. That said, if you're on PC and you're hoping for higher res visuals on the console version, you're going to be sorely disappointed because not only does this not have better graphics than the console version, it actually has some performance issues that aren't in the console version. Namely some frame rate issues that pop up on occasion, and I'm actually not really sure why, because this thing isn't particularly advanced as far as its visuals go. It shouldn't really be having all that many issues with frame rates. Luckily they did improve it over the preview build that I played before, so it is much more stable, it definitely runs better than that, and it plays a lot better than that, but it is sad to see that these issues still persist in some form. On a much less consequential note, you do occasionally see button prompts for the PS4 controller as well, even though you're using keyboard and mouse or you're using an Xbox 360 pad, or in my case an Xbox One pad. But that does bring up something that they didn't fix between the preview build and this, which is that you still cannot rebind your keys. You're just stuck with the default controls, which frankly aren't very good. Obviously on a gamepad it's fine, but if you try to play this on keyboard and mouse, you will run into problems because the controls are a bit awkward. But point about the controls aside, once you get past the visuals and the associated visual glitches and everything like that, you run into the sound design, which is generally pretty well done. It has a nice fantasy soundtrack that fits the game extremely well, although it's not particularly memorable. And the voice acting is done by the narrator, who of course tells you what's going on in terms of the story, but also narrates the voices of the various characters, which can get fairly amusing at times. Said narrator also does the same thing that Rux does in Bastion, where he talks about things that you're doing at any particular point. So for example, if you're smashing a lot of things in the background, he might comment on it, or if you're in the middle of a fight, he might chime in as the voice of Renardo and say a snarky comment or otherwise a quip. And that actually does lend a lot of charm to the game, even though there are some issues with it as well that I'll get to in a moment. If anything, the only soft-hitting aspect of the sound design is the actual sound effects themselves, which are serviceable and not much more than that. So nothing particularly stands out as being problematic in the presentation department, other than, for some people, the visual clarity issues that you might be running into. But that's something that's mitigated considerably by the art style, so it ends up working out. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as Renardo, who is an ex-pirate and now hero that is going up against the Mad Emperor who has sent his ravens out to just bring people in so they can be sacrificed in profane rituals and such like that. And as you go through the adventure, you run into various branching story paths where you make a decision on where you want to go next, and the story will play out differently depending on what you chose. And this is where I hesitate to call it a role-playing game, because the choices you make are entirely in which story bit you want to do next. Not so much decisions that you make as the character, although it is a very murky ground with that, which is why it ends up being more like a choose-your-own-adventure novel than a full-on role-playing game. Like I said, it's somewhere between an action-adventure game and an action RPG. But the point is that depending on which paths you take, the story is going to play out differently each time. And you find that this is all part of the Book of Destinies, so to speak, where all of these different endings are actually itemized in this book, and once you complete one, you are possibly given a truth, of which there are 4 in total, and you start back at the beginning of the game in order to make new choices and have a different story unfold. There are a couple of issues with this. The first is that to unlock the true ending to the game, you actually need to play through the game a minimum of 4 times, making different decisions each time in order to be able to discover all 4 of the truths that you need to unlock the actual true ending. The second is, what if you make more decisions and it doesn't lead you to another truth? Well, in some cases that's actually pretty amusing, in other cases it's not. The not amusing bit comes in when you make a decision on which path you want to follow and that leads to a dead end, as opposed to actually leading to a proper ending. What do I mean by that? Well, there are certain story paths where you can progress on them for a while and then you come up on a certain decision, and there's really only one real choice there, and if you don't choose that, then it just kills you and has you restart the previous level and go through it all over again just so you can make that same decision over again. Why they don't just go right back to the part where you actually made the decision in the first place is pretty beyond me, but it does become pretty irritating if you run into one of those dead ends. But let's say you manage to choose paths that actually give you all 4 truths and then you unlock the true ending with your next playthrough. How does the story actually work out? Well, it's interesting in the sense that the more you actually learn, the more it will play into how you can make your decisions, because the game will be like, oh, hey, by the way, that truth you learned earlier is actually applicable here, and so you should probably pay attention to that if you decide to go down this path. So there is that kind of double-edged sword where, yes, the game is very repetitive in the sense that you have to constantly play through the same levels over and over and over again because there's actually very little variation between them, but at the same time, you're still getting more and more story as you progress, and the story itself is actually fairly good. It's nothing amazing, but it's a fairly solid story, and it has some charming characters that will keep you interested, as long as you can get past the gameplay anyway. And really that's where things start to fall apart, because while the story does get kind of repetitive because you're having to play through the same levels over and over again, you're having to see the exact same story bits over and over again with slight differences depending on what you learn from the truths, it's really the gameplay that's going to make or break this thing for you, and that's simply because the gameplay itself is actually pretty simplistic. It's basically an isometric hack-and-slash game where you'll run into an area, the area will get closed off, a few enemies will spawn, you have to fight them until they're all dead, and then it will grade you based on your performance. You'll get a certain amount of experience points, which will eventually have you level up, which will then give you a skill points that you can use to upgrade your various abilities. And these can be things like simply upgrading the amount of health or magical energy you have, as well as giving you various abilities for when you're able to counter enemy attacks and be able to do more damage with them, or being able to actually dash through enemies and damage them along the way, or be able to actually hit enemies with shields as opposed to having to yank the shield out of their hands first, things like that. It's actually a pretty weak way of handling the character progression because the vast majority of abilities you can unlock are all passive stuff rather than active stuff. The combat itself just ends up being a matter of 3 buttons. One of them is your basic sword strike button, which allows you to either strike enemies with the sword, or if you press and hold it, you can slash them and grab them to be able to throw them later. Or you can use the grappling hook to pull enemies closer or yank shields out of enemies' hands. Or you can use the dash maneuver to either dash through enemies if you've unlocked that ability, or just dash out of harm's way. The meters you see at the bottom of the screen fill up, and once they're all filled up, you can actually execute a dash maneuver, and each single bar represents one dash you can pull off. So every time you dash, you basically have to wait a second or two to be able to recharge that dash. But other than that, there's really not that much complexity to the combat. There's only a handful of enemy types, and you learn their ins and outs very, very quickly, so they quickly prove to not be that much of a challenge. Especially considering that it's generally pretty easy to counter enemies' attacks and knock them off balance for an instant kill, unless they're supercharged by one of the mages, so they can't necessarily be knocked down on a counter maneuver. This means that the combat itself just ends up becoming very repetitive very quickly, and if you can put up with that, you should be able to get into the story and enjoy the game. But if you can't put up with that repetitive combat, then you're going to run into a lot of problems, because that's the vast majority of the game. The rest is spent solving extremely easy puzzles, as well as collecting materials so you can upgrade your various swords, or straight up craft ones if you haven't crafted them already. And once you craft those, you're able to access different parts of the levels that you weren't able to access before, because now you can get through the different doors that require the different types of swords. These will usually lead you to a mildly challenging fight, all things considered, as well as a chest that will either have gems in it, or crafting materials and a gem. The different gems can be socketed into one of the 3 slots on your gauntlet to give you various passive bonuses like increased damage resistance against physical attacks, or damage resistance against magical attacks, and such like that. And of course, the swords and gems do carry over into your various playthroughs, much like the various abilities do, so the more you play the game, the more powerful you become, and the easier the game ends up becoming, because now you're becoming more of an unstoppable juggernaut of death, even though the enemy variety does increase as you continue your playthroughs. The problem is when you hit the plateau, because there's a certain point throughout your playthroughs, and I reached that on playthrough 3, I believe, where the enemy variety just stops happening, where you've encountered every single type of enemy that's in the game, and you no longer have to vary up your tactics to adapt to new situations. That's a really big problem if you are one of those kind of people who goes for 100% completion, because there's a lot of endings that you'll need to go through, and they all get really repetitive really quickly. It's a good thing then that the writing is as charming and often downright funny as it is, because that's the real draw of the game. The gameplay itself is serviceable, but nothing particularly great, and the fact that it is that way ends up becoming more of a hindrance than anything else. I put a grand total of right around 5 hours into the game, and what I ended up finding with that was that once I had gotten all 4 truths and gotten through the true ending of the game, I wasn't really wanting to go back to it. That's not to say that it was a bad experience throughout that whole time, it's just that once I got through the true ending, I was like, yeah, I'm pretty satisfied with this, I'm pretty much done. Of course, I'm not a completionist. I don't need to get 100% completion in every single game that I play, so that ends up working out. But if you're like that, then you may have more problems with this, because you'll try to go through all the endings, and it will probably get very, very tedious for you at some point. But otherwise, it's a game that knows not to take itself too horribly seriously, and has a good deal of fun with what it's trying to do. Spearhead did a good job with actually putting the thing together. It's just that they could have done a few things better here and there, and that would have made it much easier to recommend. As it stands, the simplicity of the gameplay and the sheer amount of repetition makes it a harder game to recommend than what I was kind of hoping for. That said, it is still a fun time, and if it looks like something that will be right up your alley, then you should certainly give it a try at some point, because you probably will be able to get something out of it. It's just that you have to put up with a fair amount of problems to get to the parts of the game that are actually really enjoyable. I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.